still in the restroom, please make your way back to the venue. We are about to start. Vili?
Thank you so much, Vusi. So I will just start with the bios. First things first, we'll start with Prof here in the room. Professor Stephen Friedman is a professor from the University of Johannesburg. He's a research professor in the humanities faculty. He's a political scientist whose specialties are political theory and political economy. He has regularly participated in public debate through newspaper columns and is the author of several books, including Prisoners of the Past, a study of contemporary South Africa. Then I'll jump on to Toko Medonk, and I'll just apologize if, for example, I'm getting your names, spelling them incorrectly. Okay, just a second. The glitches between. Okay, so Thokozile is currently a researcher at the Southern Center of Inequality Studies at Wits, managing the Public Economy Project. Using her master's in political theory, she has worked in the areas of climate justice, development cooperation, public finance with a focus on health financing and gender responsive budgeting, national, subnational, and parliamentary governance, transparency, and accountability. Over the years, she has served as a program manager in the Boel Foundation, coordinator of the Budget Expenditure Monitoring Forum, and an organizer of the People's Health Movement in South Africa. And then we'll introduce Andreas as well, who is joining us online together with Thokozile. Okay, Andres is a visiting research fellow at the research department of the South African Reserve Bank and a lecturer at the University of Technology. He retired from the OECD in 2016. Before, he was responsible for economic surveys and projections of 17 countries, among them South Africa, Turkey, Russia, Ukraine, and Germany. Before joining the OECD Economics Department in 2000, he pursued an academic career in economics at the Institute for Advanced Studies and the University of Technology in Vienna. Then we go to Thokozile. Okay, Thokozile Chuma is a policy specialist focusing on inclusive growth from the United Nations Development Program. He's an economist with a strong macroeconomics, microeconomics, and econometric background, and able to conduct independent research and global and regional economic, social, and development issues, and determine suitability, validity, and accuracy of data from different sources. So I think with that long biographical introduction, we really have a fascinating panel. So we'll start with you, Prof. You give us your presentation for about 20 minutes, and then we'll take Andreas, and thereafter do the discussions.
Thank you. Thanks. Are those 20 human minutes or academic minutes?
They're in the spirit of austerity, I would believe they're human.
Human minutes, oh well. I tried. I can't be accused of not trying. And just one correction, which is not the chair's fault because it has to be corrected. I don't do newspaper columns anymore because none of the newspapers will publish them. But I do a subscription column each week which goes out to subscribers all over the country, and one in America. So we could have a 3-minute break while you all get online and subscribe, or you can do so after the session. Okay, having got the commercial out of the way. As you will have gathered from the rest of the CV, I'm interested in political economy, but as you will be hearing, far more from the political angle than from the economic angle. So I don't have any numbers to put up or any graphs, etc. But a lot of what I have to say will be based on an interpretation of the work of an economic historian whose name will hopefully be familiar to some people in the room, Douglas North. Now, what I want to do is to suggest that the way in which we tend to think about the economy and the way in which we tend to discuss the economy at events like these, and generally when people trained in economics meet, is not the appropriate way of understanding what is happening in South Africa and what needs to happen in South Africa. And perhaps just to flesh that out a bit, I mean, what I have in mind is that I have for a while been both fascinated and appalled by, what, to be polite, one could call in this country the jobs debate. And it really is polite to call it a debate, because how in fact the jobs debate works is that whatever your particular economic or political perspective, whether you're a free marketeer or a Marxist-Leninist or something in between, it has become almost compulsory to insist that if we simply do what you tell us to do, we will create millions of jobs. And of course, they differ slightly. Some of them claim we create 6 million, and some of them create 8 million. And any day now, somebody will claim that they have the formula for creating 10 million. And of course, what we do see is something which one could call magical thinking. And the way in which magical thinking works is that whenever the policy recipes which the people in the debate advocate are tried, they don't create all these millions of jobs. And then when you say to the people, but your policy recipes don't provide 8 million jobs, they say, oh no, well, you didn't apply them properly. You need to apply them in a more vigorous manner. And of course, that's an infinite escape clause, because you can never apply them in as vigorous a manner as the people who are advocating them suggest. And I've been intrigued for quite some time by why we have this debate when it is so clearly disconnected from reality. And I try to give the answer in a book of mine, which was published a couple of years ago, in which I try to look at where South Africa is almost 30 years into democracy. And that is where Douglas North's work became important, although if you ever get to read the book, I'm not an uncritical admirer of North, so I engage with him in the book, and I think that there are problems about some of what he has to say. But one of the contributions which North made to our discussion of economics and how it affects the well-being of human beings is that he wrote quite a bit of what he wrote because he was very unimpressed by and very unhappy with what was the World Bank orthodoxy at the time. And the World Bank orthodoxy at the time was, we need to get the prices right. As long as we get the prices of land, labor, and capital right, then all good things will flow from that. And North noticed that too didn't seem to conform to reality, because every time people got the prices right, all the good things didn't flow from it. And what he suggested was that the problem was not the prices. The problem was what he called institutions. And he incidentally has had quite a lot of influence on the World Bank and other institutions, because within a few years of North's work appearing, they stopped talking about getting the prices right, and they started talking about getting the institutions right. Now, one of the frustrating things about Douglas North, if you read his work, is that he writes a great deal about institutions, but he never actually goes into any particular detail on what he thinks institutions are and what they're not. Fortunately, we have the work of scholars who've been influenced by North, and they tell us that there are three elements to institutions. And I'll come to those three elements in a moment. But the importance of institutions in all of this is that North developed the concept of path dependence, which is central to what I'm trying to do in the book. And you probably all heard the phrase, etc. But in case you haven't, path dependent. What North was trying to do with path dependence was to say that societies could change some things, and particularly they could change their political systems. But if they didn't change their institutions, then they would carry on much as they had before economically. As I mentioned, North was an economic historian, and he was interested in growth, and he was trying to show why in some countries all the right economic recipes had been applied, but growth had not been the result of that. And he said, well, the reason for that is path dependence, because people carried on with the same institutions. And if you carry on with the same institutions, it doesn't matter what economic recipes you apply, and it doesn't matter whether you change your political system or not. Now, I said I'd come back to what institutions are, how we understand how I understand institutions. And using the work of a scholar influenced by North called Scott Page, we take three elements of institutions which may remain the same when a society is changing. And the three institutions are behavior patterns, and that, for our purposes, that's, if you like, the way in which people operate in the marketplace, the way in which people operate in formal businesses, the way in which people operate in the profession, etc. Do they continue to operate much the same way as they did before? The second one is cognitive patterns, which really is what we value and what we don't value. And the third one is relationships. In other words, relationships between business and government, relationships between sections of business and political power, etc. And essentially the argument is that if you change your political system or you change your economic policy, and those three elements remain the same, the behavior patterns, the cognitive patterns, and the relationships, then nothing much will change. Then you will continue to have slow or low growth. As you might have gathered by this stage, I find this very useful because I think it is a very accurate description of South Africa in the year 2023. Because we did change our political system in 1994, but we really didn't change all that much else. The expectations of what it takes to promote growth are very much the same as they were. And the structure of the economy isn't that much different. I always try, it's just as a kind of illustrative point. Some of us are old enough to remember that in the last decade or so of apartheid, it used to be mentioned repeatedly that 5 companies controlled 90% of the equity on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Well, right now, about 20 companies control 80% of the equity on the JSE. So you can say it's progress because there are more companies and slightly less equity, but you wouldn't seriously say that the overall pattern had changed significantly. And that is true of much of what is done in the economy. The amount of effort, which is an energy which is devoted to the formal economy, is disproportionate when we remember that, by my rough calculation, it's a rough calculation, but I give the numbers and what it's based on in the book, about 2/3 of adults in this country can't get into the formal economy. So we tend to spend a lot of time, and yes, obviously that is where the wealth is, that's where the economic power is, I'm not being unrealistic about that, but we tend to spend an inordinate amount of time when we talk about issues like poverty, like job creation, on focusing on the experience of 1/3 of the population than we do about the 2/3 of the population. And one of the ways in which path dependence operates, which is crucial to the way in which we look at the economy, is this point that Page makes about the cognitive patterns, about what we consider important and what we don't consider important. And it begins to explain why, in an economy in which 2/3 of adults are engaged in some kind of informal activity because they can't break into the formal activity, we continually talk about only formal sector jobs. And I argue that the reason for that is that one of the cognitive patterns which remains the same is that what we've been trying to do, or what the people who make the decisions have been trying to do in the society since 1994, is that we've been trying to create what I call in the book white privilege for everybody. What I mean by that is, if you take the way in which white people lived at the height of apartheid, that is taken as the norm of how everybody should live. And one can understand why that is the case. But one can also understand that it is clearly an entirely unrealistic view. Because we should be aware that the way in which white people lived under apartheid was possible only because the vast majority of people were excluded from opportunities. So the idea that you can extend to everybody what some people have because they excluded everybody else is not a particularly realistic example. And I give in the book some concrete cases in how this works. But one of the things that happened at the height of apartheid, if you were a white person, and for a while, even if you were a black person, but that didn't last terribly long, is that you were pretty much assured that once you got to adulthood, you would find yourself a job in a factory or an office or a shop. And the model in everybody's heads, therefore, of what a workable economy which meets people's needs is one in which everybody gets up in the morning and goes to a shop or a factory or an office. And that is why we have people promising 8 million such jobs, 6 million, and et cetera, as I went through. But as I've just said, it's not a realistic proposition. It's not a realistic proposition for a variety of reasons. One obvious point is that South Africans sometimes like to think that we're different from the rest of the world, but we're not all that different from the rest of the world. And the kind of jobs which white people used to go to in the 1960s are being extinguished all over the world. So it's not quite clear how they're miraculously going to reappear. In a period where people are talking about driverless cars and artificial intelligence, etc. The idea that somehow everybody is going to be working in those mass production jobs which were available in the 1960s doesn't seem a particularly plausible idea. So that is the reality with which we sit. And that means that although I'm obviously not being extreme about this, I'm not saying that formal job creation is irrelevant and we should stop talking about it. It does seem to me that we need to recognize that in the lifespan of everybody in this room, and probably their children, and maybe even quite possibly their grandchildren, there are going to be very large numbers of South Africans, whatever economic model we adopt, who will not be participating in the formal economy, who will not be getting up in the morning and going to those shops and factories and offices. And the question, therefore, has to be, well, what is the policy challenge? How do we deal with that? And it doesn't seem to, I mean, it obviously creates difficulties, etc., and challenges, but then any serious policy problem does that. That we need initially to start thinking of this in a different way. And the different way in which we need to start thinking of it is that we need to start talking less about jobs and we need to start talking more about livelihoods. And of course, the difference between jobs and livelihoods is that a job means you have a formal employer and a livelihood means that you have a variety of, it obviously includes formal employment, but there are also other ways in which, I mean, whether it's backyard panel beating or selling fruit and vegetables on street corners or whatever the case may be. Once we start doing that, it becomes possible to I think, begin having a serious conversation about, to take the theme of this particular panel, what our spending priorities ought to be and what our policy priorities ought to be. Now, I think it's very important when I make this point to stress what I'm not saying as well as what I am. The argument that informal economic employment is important has been around in this country for a very long time. In fact, it used to be used by certain people under apartheid as a rather shabby excuse for that system's failure to pay any attention to the welfare needs of 90% of the population, because they'd simply say, oh yeah, well, those black people who aren't participating in the economy, they're all busy in the informal sector somewhere. And there was no, and it became clownish at one point. I remember one person who used to appear at conferences, etc. He used to start his speeches usually by saying, the informal sector is entirely unrecorded and entirely unresearched, and it consists of 12.7 million people earning it. Which raised the obvious question of, well, it's entirely unresearched, and I talked about how did he know how many people there were and what they were earning? And of course, the answer was he didn't know. He was making it up as he went along because it was a nice rhetorical flourish. The point I'm trying to make through that is that it can very often, the emphasis on the informal can very often become an excuse for simply allowing economic practices and patterns which do not contribute to human welfare. And of course, as in the case I mentioned, it can be used as an excuse for all sorts of things. That is the case if we assume that the stress on the informal and on livelihoods rather than jobs means a very simple laissez-faire approach in which we say, well, get rid of all the health regulations and all the bylaws, etc., and just let people do their own thing. And that is not at all what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that we need simply to recognize that this is a reality which we have to have a policy response to. And that policy response inevitably, if it's a pragmatic response and it's a response which is rooted in the actual circumstances in which people live rather than in very abstract theories based on our desire to recreate something which white people enjoyed a very long time ago, will be a mixture of some of the deregulation measures, but also some interventionist measures. It would presumably entail freeing people up more to do what they're doing at the moment. But on its own, that would not really change the welfare equation unless there were also positive programs which stimulated what people were doing, hooked them up to the formal economy where that is appropriate, and enabled them to actually develop what they're doing rather than simply staying where they are at the moment. When we were sorry. Thanks. How much? 3 minutes with the water. Sorry, I have this coffee. When we were discussing this in the run-up to this meeting, one of the participants in the room said, sorry. Okay. No, it's not helping. Okay. Right. Sorry, I think I'm back on track. One of the participants said, well, when you see people being exploited on the street, when you see people begging, etc., that is also a livelihood. And of course, they're quite right. And that is why we need to see it as a policy challenge rather than as a simple exhortation to simply deregulate and let things develop as they may. You may be talking, for example, about measures at some point which compel formal sector businesses, where appropriate, to have a relationship with informal businesses, a procurement relationship, or something else which enables it. And you would also probably have to do something serious about the lobbying power of formal businesses, because we don't often recognize in our policy debate, and I'm generalizing to a certain extent, but a great many of the obstacles which are placed in the way of informal activity in this country are placed there by business lobbies, very often the same business lobbies who extol the free market, but who don't like the idea of being undercut and the competition of people in the informal economy. So that is by way of saying that there are a host of policy challenges and policy debates which flow from concentrating on the informal. But we do need to get beyond the jobs debate, and we do need to get into the livelihoods debate. Because if we don't do that, I'm afraid the reality is simply that the conversations that we have about the economy are increasingly going to be deeply detached from reality. I had the privilege some years ago of participating in a project with African Central Bank governors, in which we try to debate various political economy issues. And one of the striking features of this engagement is that the people we were dealing with were extraordinarily talented, extraordinarily intelligent economists and with a very sophisticated grasp of economics. But the one thing they found it difficult to accept is the extent to which the formal market in which they were engaged was largely detached from the economic reality of most of the citizens of the country, which of course is why very often the prices which applied in the formal marketplace were not those which applied out in the streets where people were engaged in economic activity. Because sophisticated people everywhere like to believe that everybody is in the same space as they are and doing the same things as they are, even when reality suggests that's not the case. So to sum up, I believe that one of the effects of path dependence in this country is that we are currently looking at the economy in a way which sees only the formal economy as it currently operates as a potential source of jobs and therefore of welfare, and that we tend to see the kind of economic patterns of behavior which prevail in that sector as the ones with which we need to engage if we're going to formulate workable policy. I'm challenging you to contemplate the possibility that we need to look at this from a different perspective, that we need to look at the realities in the society, the ways in which people are generating livelihoods and could generate greater livelihoods in the future, and that ought to be the building block from which we debate policy in the future. Thank you. And sorry about the coughing, but it seems to have gone.
That's good. Thank you so much, Prof. We are then now going to switch on to Andreas. He also has a presentation focusing on the labor utilization in SA. You have about 20 minutes as well. Andreas, if you could please stick to the time, because I think we're going to have really insightful discussion. So let's save more for later. Over to you.
So I hope you can see and hear me now. Well, I mean, this presentation by Professor Friedman is, of course, fascinating, especially for me as an economist. And I could make my job, of course, easier, and I could say, okay, let's just accept that economists don't have this, are incapable of saying anything that helps understanding the economy, either in South Africa or anywhere else. And so we have saved the extra 15 minutes that Professor Friedman has used for his presentation. Now, I will not take this shortcut, but I'm insisting, and as it has been mentioned already before, I have my last active job was with the OECD. And I mean, the special thing about the OECD is that it tries and it has the ambition to do comparative analysis, yeah, to look how are things happening in many countries of this world, and what can countries learn from each other. So now try to solve the next challenge to upload my presentation. Okay, here we are. My starting point is, oh, sorry, I'm too far. My starting point is this figure here. I have to apologize in advance for the slides. I hope on your screens they are looking better than on my screen. What this figure shows is how far behind in terms of formal sector economy, formal sector economic activity, are various countries, and how can this difference be disaggregated into the, let's say, lower productivity and in the participation of the population in economic activity, meaning in working. And then you see these little triangles are the aggregates of the two. And the third, I don't know whether you see my little arrow moving on your screens, I hope at least. The third country from the left is South Africa. And we see, at least this is what I want you to see, that South Africa is an outlier. It has organized its economy differently from all the other economies that are shown on this figure here, which are mainly emerging markets from India to Turkey. Now, roughly speaking, let's say the situation is such that in most countries, except South Africa, lagging behind the top formal sector economies of this world is mainly due to a lower productivity. Yeah, so these are these long bars here. Yeah, and participation in the economy by the population, meaning working, contributing to economic activity. Now, I have to say this both refers to formal sector activity and informal sector activity. Yeah, that for these purposes, it doesn't matter whether you work in the formal sector or not in the formal sector. And here we see that South Africa has the highest share of the population that is not participating in economic activity, no matter whether it is formal sector activity or informal sector activity. And that, of course, contributes to, let's say, the lagging behind of living standards on average that we can see in this country. And I will also argue that this is also behind the still appalling rate of inequality that we can observe in this country. So South Africa is one of the highest inequality indicators in the world. So what I would like to do now is to take a look what I think is contributing to this phenomenon. So why inactivity is such a widespread issue in South Africa, contrary to any comparable other country in this world. So I of course, no big phenomenon, neither in economy or in politics, has one single explanation. So it's a whole bouquet of reasons that are contributing to this outcome. But I think one of the most visible problems in the South African way of how to organize its economy is how the transition of school leavers, that do not go on to university, one has to make this separation. How are they getting into employment? And this transition for, let's say, either secondary school dropouts or secondary school graduates that are not going on to university, it is just not working. And if you like here, let's say my capacity as an OECD economist is becoming visible. The question is, are there other countries that are doing a better job here? And there are. A second issue is that regional and gender gaps of economic activity and also availability of jobs are very high in South Africa. That's contributing to this issue of inactivity, because if you are living in a region where there are no jobs, transport costs are exorbitant, and the availability of housing closer to where the jobs are is not very good, or at least it is not affordable, for the kind of job holders that would be wanting to move into these jobs. Then this again is a major source of keeping people inactive just where they are living. Now, I'm also a macroeconomist, and there, of course, it is clear that economic activity and employment are linked. Now we know that South Africa has a bad record of economic growth since more or less about 15 years. The economy is barely growing, and therefore, I mean, all these millions of jobs that are promised by introducing the right policies are not created, which is not surprising, because if the economy doesn't grow, then you will also not have job creation. So I think we should also take a look into this. So, as I mentioned before, one of the major reasons for inactivity is that youth unemployment is very high. So there are surveys that show that about 80% of youngsters that have either graduated from secondary school and not went on to university, or have dropped out from school are still unemployed. And the three humps that you see on the right-hand side of this slide, they show the employment rates in South Africa, in Brazil, and in OECD countries. And I mean, what you see there is that that in South Africa, it just takes 10 to 20 years longer, in terms of age, until, let's say, the highest employment shares are reached for the population overall. So that means during that time, people are inactive. They are sitting somewhere, literally, and waiting for a job to be offered to them. And that, for instance, in Brazil, that's not the case, yeah? I mean, or in the OECD as a whole, it's also not the case. And this has a lot to do with the way how the transition from school to jobs is organized. Now, in countries where this transition is working very well, these, for instance, are continental European countries like Germany, Netherlands, Austria, Switzerland. This transition is organized in the way of vocational training, yeah, that is offered in parallel to an employment position in a company, and where the employers are having decide, yeah, who is participating in this vocational training and vocational education track. And employers also provide an employment guarantee once this education or this type of school is finished. And therefore, it is, it is no wonder that, for instance, in a country like Germany, 25% of a cohort that is leaving school and doesn't move on to university is participating in such an arrangement. And another 25% is enrolled in vocational schools, yeah, without sort of an employment contract, but with employers and social partners very closely working together to decide about the curriculum in these schools. And therefore, graduates from these educational programs, they have an employment rate of, let's say, between 95 and 100% after they graduate. Yeah, so this is just the opposite. So, I mean, what I want to say, of course, is fascinating what Professor Friedman says. But I think we should also keep our mind open for experiences in other countries. So not necessarily, yeah, the way how South Africa is doing things is the only one feasible. Things can be done differently, yeah, and well, I don't want to say that this is an easy task. So maybe this is a little bit less problematic, or well, is not of the same order of importance as what I said previously. More or less in every country, regional economic activity is differing from one region to the other. And that is also the case, especially, of course, in South Africa, where place-based economic activity like mining, yeah, is still playing a big role. Yeah. And South Africa is not only sticking out in terms of its high rate of inactivity, but I think it's the only not landlocked country where the economic centers, yeah, of the country are inland, which, of course, in an age of globalization and of trading with distant markets and so on, is not an advantage. Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you have to ship your goods either on lorries or railways to the hundreds of miles to the next harbor, this is, of course, establishing an entry barrier into foreign trade. So that's certainly also something to be kept in mind. And I mean, I think there is no other not landlocked country where the most active region is actually inland, yeah, which in the case of, sorry, here we are with unemployment, so on this slide, yeah. So the Gauteng province is, of course, inland, yeah, having the about 50% higher regional economic activity than sort of the average South African regions, whereas the coastal areas, with the exception of Western Cape, like Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, are among the regions in South Africa with the lowest regional GDP, which is exceptional. Yeah. Now, one South Africa, no, maybe not the only, but in terms of overall importance, one South African specificity is the still very important role of traditional settlement areas. Yeah. Now, these traditional settlement areas, of course, they are not identical with the apartheid homelands, but there is a big overlap. And what we see in these areas is that there is 1/3 of the Black African population is living in these areas with a very, very low availability of jobs, with a few, let's say, exceptions. When you find an area like the Bafokeng Kingdom, where you have a platinum mine, or I think they also have casinos or things of that sort, then okay, you have jobs there. But overall, yeah, without these exceptions, these are areas where there is very little economic activity, and it shows also in the household structure. So typically in these areas, the head of household is a woman, which there's nothing wrong about it, but it is because the men have been migrating to other regions where they are hoping to find a job. So that is, of course, I mean, this 1/3 of the Black African population is facing big obstacles, yeah, in finding a role in the economy, and that's contributing to the overall rate of inactivity. Like in many other countries, it's nothing special for South Africa. There is also in some provinces of South Africa, there is a big difference of female and male unemployment. And if we do a scatter plot, yeah, on the right-hand side, then we see that this difference is higher if the overall rate of unemployment, or also call it an indicator of inactivity, is higher. So that is also contributing to overall inactivity. Finally, as I mentioned already, South Africa is having a very low rate of growth, yeah, and this is coinciding with a low or a high rate of inactivity. If we would just carry out the back of the envelope calculation and see what would change in terms of economic growth if South Africa would move its labor participation rate towards Turkey. I mean, Turkey isn't the best student in class in these terms either, but that would lift South African growth rates by 2%. Also, I have to be careful saying that this is not a causality. Yeah, it is a pattern that we observe for other countries. So it's worthwhile to think about how to change the situation in South Africa in terms of labor force participation. And yeah, before that, I should also mention that the high rate of inactivity is also contributing to inequality. So in measured with the Gini coefficient, South Africa has one of, I think, even the highest rate of inequality in the world, or at least of among comparable countries. And the contribution of the bottom 20% to overall economic activity is also the lowest. Yeah, I mean, that's not really surprising. So as a conclusion, I would say if South Africa wants to tackle its low rate of economic growth, meaning if it wants to converge to a higher level of economic activity, then it has to tackle its high rate of inactivity. And of course, I wouldn't be from the OECD if I wouldn't have a long list of recommendations here. But maybe this I should keep this actually for the panel, and should end my presentation now. And thank you very much for your attention.